Hello and welcome back to our second Camtasia video lecture dealing with Chapter 2, which is job order costing, calculating the unit product cost. So in our prior video, we demonstrated how costs flow through the job costing system. Specifically, we saw direct material and direct labor, but we didn't look at manufacturing overhead. So in this video rather, we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at allocating manufacturing overhead. But in order to do that, we need to compute what we call a predetermined overhead rate. So the predetermined overhead rate needs an allocation base. Okay, what's the allocation base? Well, in job order costing, we either use things like direct labor hours, we could use direct labor dollars, or we could even use machine hours. And we use those amounts to assign that manufacturing overhead to the individual jobs. Okay, so why then do we need to allocate based on some direct labor dollars or machine hours? Well, we need to realize that the predetermined overhead rate is actually calculated before we start working on the jobs. So we have absolutely no idea. Excuse me. Let me rephrase that. We don't know the exact amount of overhead that we're actually going to incur for each job. Okay, so we need to allocate everything, right? Well, number one, we already know that manufacturing overhead is indirect. So that means that it is virtually impossible or very, very difficult for us to trace those overhead costs to a specific job. Okay, so that's one reason why we use an allocation base. Second reason that we use an allocation base is that the manufacturing overhead by design includes a number of different indirect costs. We have the indirect material and we have the indirect labor. So because we have many different costs, we got to use the allocation base. And then finally, we need to recognize that the costs that we incur that are in this manufacturing overhead, meaning these indirect costs, they're going to fluctuate, okay, throughout the period, right? Because manufacturing overhead, remember, is made up of both direct and indirect costs, right? So we have, or let me rephrase that, fixed and variable costs, right? So manufacturing overhead includes all the indirect costs, but those indirect costs behave some fixed, some variable, some even mixed. Okay, so those are the three reasons why we need to use an allocation base. Now, if you remember, I said that the allocation base in the overhead, we need to estimate that, right? We need to do this at the beginning of a job. Why? Well, in order to quote a job, meaning somebody comes to us and says, "Hey, I want you to build me a mansion. How much are you going to charge me for it?" Well, we need to figure out how much it's going to cost us to make that mansion in order to provide, in order to quote a good price that will hopefully provide us with some income, right? Some net operating income after we pay out those expenses. So we have to guesstimate at the beginning of the period or the beginning of the job. Okay, so this slide right here, very important. We're going to be using this a lot throughout the course, and basically it's the equation for how to calculate the predetermined overhead rate. Okay, and basically what we do is we estimate the total manufacturing overhead costs for the coming period. Okay, the total manufacturing overhead cost that includes all the fixed portion of the manufacturing overhead and the variable portion of the manufacturing overhead. We divide that by some estimated allocation base. Okay, we saw in the past slide we can either use direct labor dollars, direct labor hours, or we can use machine hours. Okay, that's going to be our estimate, and we're going to estimate over the coming period or over the year how much machine hours are we going to use, or what's the amount of the direct labor dollars that we anticipate using over the next year. Okay, now you're probably asking, well, how do I know which one to use? Well, for class purposes, the problem's going to tell you what the allocation base is. Okay, however, in the real world, you're always going to want to pick an allocation base that actually drives the cost of the overhead, right? Or what cost incurs that overhead cost. What do you mean? Well, what I mean is, in the real world, if we're making a product and we're working on a job and our job requires a lot of skilled labor, right? Well, it would make sense that because that overhead cost, that indirect overhead cost, is generated by a lot of labor, we should use direct labor as the allocation base. Okay, what if we use a lot of machine hours? Well, if we use a lot of machine hours and that total manufacturing estimated overhead cost for the coming period is estimated based on us using a lot of machine hours, then we should use the machine hours as the allocation base. Okay, so what do we need for the predetermined overhead rate, right? Well, again, we're applying it based on estimates, right? What do we estimate our data to be, right? Well, why can't we just use real data? Why do we have to estimate? Well, it's because that the actual overhead, we're not going to know until the period's over, right? So that really that doesn't do us any good, right? We know at the end of the period, here's the exact amount of overhead cost that was incurred, right? Well, how are we going to be able to estimate job costs during the period, right? Well, how we're going to do that is by using estimates. Okay, keep in mind that those actual overhead costs, they're going to fluctuate, right, throughout the year, right? Why? Well, due to seasons, right? So if some way we could use actual overhead costs, they're going to fluctuate, and that's going to be difficult for us as making decisions because there's that fluctuating seasonal cost. So here is an example of how to compute predetermined overhead costs. And the main thing that we need to recognize that this is a four-step process, and it's really easy. It really is. Okay, first thing we got to do is we got to estimate the total amount of the allocation base. That's our denominator, right? That's our cost driver. How much are we going to use for the next period based on the production level that we think we're going to have? Okay, so it's all estimates. Once we estimate that allocation base or that cost driver, the second thing we got to do is we need to estimate total fixed manufacturing overhead costs, again, for the upcoming period. Keep in mind that manufacturing overhead based on traceability is an indirect cost. However, even though it's indirect, it behaves very differently, right? Manufacturing overhead costs could be variable, could be fixed, or there could be a combination of fixed and mixed. Okay, so we need to calculate that total manufacturing overhead. Third thing we need to do is we need to use our equation, which is y equals a plus bx, to calculate that total manufacturing overhead. Now, this might look foreign, it might look intimidating. I promise you it is not. It is so easy. All right. Y is the total manufacturing overhead cost. Okay. But that total is made up of a variable portion and a fixed portion. Well, A represents what the total fixed overhead portion is. B is the estimated manufacturing overhead cost per unit or per the allocation base. X is nothing more than the estimated total amount of the allocation base. Okay? Fourth thing we got to do, hey, we got to compute the predetermined overhead rate. Again, might look a little intimidating, totally not. Very easy to, well, basically just plugging and chugging is really what it is once we recognize conceptually what the predetermined overhead rate is, how we develop these estimates, knowing that the total manufacturing overhead is going to be variable and fixed. Super duper easy. Okay, now we're going to see how to apply it, but what I want to do is work through a quick example, okay, before we do that. If you look at your study guide, you'll see that I think it's problem number 1, I believe, right? And I tried to be a little funny and give you a fictitious company. I think it was Peter Griffin Incorporated, right? So basically, what the problem says is that we need to figure out what their predetermined overhead rate is. Okay, we don't need to apply it; we just need to calculate it. And in order to do that, we need to kind of pull apart the pieces that we need. And bear with me 1 second. I want to enter. There we go. Okay. So they tell us that its plant-wide predetermined overhead rate annually is based on direct labor hours. So direct labor hours, and I'm just going to abbreviate and say DLH, that's our allocation base. Okay. And they tell us at the beginning of the year it estimated 20,000 direct labor hours. Okay. Then they tell us that the company also estimated $94,000 of fixed overhead for the coming period. So this is the fixed. I'm going to put an F, MOH as an abbreviation. Okay. And then they told us that the variable MOH is $2 per direct labor hour. Okay, so what we need to do, after that it says Harris's actual manufacturing overhead cost for the year was $123,900 and its actual direct labor was $21,000. Or Peter Griffin's whatever, gives you the actual. Okay, we do not need any actual numbers, so I'm going to say no actual numbers at this point. Okay, why? Because what we need to do is compute the plant-wide, or the company's plant-wide predetermined overhead rate. Okay, so we know the first thing, like the first first step we have to do is we need to estimate total allocation base, right? Well, we did that already. The total allocation base is 20,000 direct labor hours. Next, we need to estimate the total fixed MOH. Well, we did that. They told us that the fixed manufacturing overhead is $94,000. The third step is to use the following equation to estimate the total amount of manufacturing overhead. Okay, so in order to do that, we need to say y equals a. Well, my a are my fixed costs. Plus b of x. Okay, well, I know that my b, my b equals the variable MOH, or manufacturing overhead per unit, and my x is my allocation base, or the amount of allocation base. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say y, and I'm just going to plug and chug now. Y equals a. Well, what are my fixed costs? $94,000 plus $2 times 20,000. Right? The 20,000 is my direct labor hours. So if I think about it, I have y equals 94,000 plus 40,000. So y, or total manufacturing overhead, is the 94,000 plus the 40,000, gives me $134,000. This is my estimated total MOH, which includes the fixed portion and the variable portion. So how do I figure out what my predetermined overhead rate is? It's very simple. Remember the calculation, and I'm going to go back just to show us. The POR, predetermined overhead rate, equals the estimated total overhead cost for the coming period. In our example, it's $134,000, divided by the estimated total unit in the allocation base for the coming period. Well, guess what? That's our direct labor hours, which we already know is 20,000 hours. So, to calculate the predetermined overhead rate, I'm going to say 134,000 divided by 20,000 equals 6.7, or $6.70. So that then is what I would apply to each job. We didn't get there yet, right? We're just right now calculating the predetermined overhead rate and based on this, that means that for every direct labor hour a job incurs, we are going to apply $6.70 per direct labor hour, and that is how we apply the manufacturing overhead. Okay, so we went through, we saw how to calculate the predetermined overhead rate, and we worked on our first exercise within the study guide. Okay, when we come back in our next video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at, okay, we have the predetermined overhead rate. Now how do we're going to see how we apply it. Okay, so excuse me, so please tune back in for that video.